We're just going to be talking about contrast medium and Lahmian medium and why you would ever want to use either of them for any reason whatsoever when painting your miniatures, and also the reasons why I use them the way I use them, because they do fundamentally they do the same thing. Okay, they are a medium, and a medium is basically a paint without any color in it. Okay, so this is paint, this is paint. It just doesn't have the same sort of pigment in it as that. Okay, so this is just blank that. Okay, in its essence, it's how medium works. Okay, and why would you want to use such a thing? Well, you could use it if you were really technical. You could mix your own pigments into this to create your own colors, as it were, which is something you could do, for example, with there's something called I have it over there, it's like the Artificer set that Games Workshop made, which is literally just pigment that you can just add to things, and the examples they give in that is you put the blue in some silver, and that's how you get Alpha Legion silver. That's, you know, it's cool. But you could put it in that, for example, and make a, you know, you could make a, depending on the ratios of that, this would be a full pot of this would be 18 milliliters, and you'd probably have to do a little bit of 24 milliliters actually is how much is in there. You could put your, you know, you could mix a pigment into that and create a very, very thin wash, for example. But that's what these are used for, okay, is basically thinning paint. Now, a lot of the time you'll get told to just use water because water is free. Well, not free, but water can be. You're already paid for it, right? If you pay your water bill, you've already paid for it, and it comes out of the tap. And water is a perfectly good thinner for your paint, and I think generally a lot of people understand that to get thinned paint and to get it on nice and smooth, you thin your paints down when it comes to your base and layer paints, because they're a lot thicker than a contrast paint, which is very, very, very liquid. It's very runny. However, water is water, and these are paint. So, when you're using a medium to thin down your paint, you're thinning down a paint with paint to create thinner paint. Is basically how it works, okay? And, well, contrast medium is contrast paint without any colour. Lamian medium is just, well, basically old formulated shade paint without any colour in it, if that makes any sense at all. It's very, very thin, and well, we shall get into explaining this a little bit later on. We got some questions in the chat. Lamian medium greater than contrast medium. Never managed to get contrast medium to work consistently. Lamian medium just works, always works, and creates way nicer finish on my paint jobs. This is a good point here, Mr. Tumnus 1987. Now, contrast paints have a higher, to get it nice and smooth, okay? So this is where the thing with contrast paints, this is where the debate comes up with contrast paints, okay? Are they a tool to just slap paint on quickly to get your models done quickly? Or are they a tool to be kind of more measured with and create a sort of smooth paint scheme, but one that cuts out a lot of time in terms of shading and stuff like that? The answer is they are both things at the same time, which is mind-blowing. But a tool can be two things at the same time, right? And that is what contrast paint is. However, one of the things with contrast paint is that if you are just going to slap it on but expect a really smooth finish, you're not going to get it. If you take your time, like I do, you will get a smooth finish, but you're no longer slapping it on, which means you're slowing down the process in that regard, but you're speeding up in the regard that you're not having to shade and this, that, and the other and that. There's lots of trade-offs, and there's kind of benefits to both and this, that, and the other. So the question that often comes up is, why wouldn't you just use like a base paint to paint in the base colors and then shade it? And it's like, yeah, you could do that. You absolutely could do that. There is a trade-off to that, because in my workflow, if we're using Mephiston Red, and I always go to Mephiston Red as an example, but if we're using Mephiston Red to paint a Blood Angel, and then we shade it. We can either recess shade it, which is time spent, or we can shade it all over. But at that point, we're going to shade it, and it's going to be a different color to what it originally was. And if Mephiston red was the color that we wanted it to be, we have to relayer it at that point anyway. In addition, when you are painting with base and layer paints, it generally takes 2 thin coats, because you don't do it in this measured way, because you don't need to. You just brush it on, and it'll leave like marks and slightly see-through bits, and you'll see brush strokes. But then you put your second layer on, you get a nice smooth cut. So in that instance, when you're doing your base and layer paints, you're going for 2 coats, a shade, and possibly a relayer if that's what you're going to do. Whereas contrast paint, you will do 1 layer generally. If you do it measured in the way that I do it, you don't have to do the shade and relayer. Okay? Now, the caveat to all of this is that requires a different style of painting. And if you aren't used to that different style of painting, this is where the mediums now come in. Okay? So, contrast paint. Famously, you can get dark spots, you can get patchiness, you can get coffee staining, you can get all of this kind of thing. And that comes from the technique that's being used with the paint. This is contrast medium. And contrast medium will make your contrast paints more contrast paint. So you take 1 drop load of Blood Angels red and 1 drop load of contrast medium. What you get is a half strength Blood Angels red. You've diluted it, but it's still contrast paint. So if the technique before is what was slowing you down, if the technique of using the contrast paints is you're slapping it on and you're using the contrast paint and you're thinning it down with contrast medium to somehow make it a bit easier, all you've done here is you've lessened the strength of your Blood Angels red. But it's still contrast paint. It still works the same way, okay? Now, Lahmian Medium, on the other hand, well, it's not contrast paint. That's just like thinned paint, okay? Now, this will not create more contrast paint. What it will do is it will interact strangely with the contrast paint in such a way where it will thin it down and it will dilute the colour, but nowhere near as much as contrast medium. And we'll get into the reason why I think that happens in just a sec. So, here's the thing, right, with contrast paint. We've done a little bit of this already on the channel, but what we're going to do is I'm just going to show you the difference in a contrast paint, right? So, I've got Blood Angels red open, and those who are live with me right now will understand, but I'll do this with Creed Camo to begin with. If we take a brush load of Creed Camo, okay, and we apply this on our piece of palette paper here, right, and we just give it a good zhuzhing like this to try and separate out our pigments. There you go. What you can see is we have our darker color here and we have our lighter color over here, and these both exist at the same time in Creed Camo, hence why it's a contrast paint. So when we apply it over the top of a model, we get this in the darker recesses, hopefully, and we get this on the flatter panels, based on how we apply things. So, this is important because contrast medium is the same, and you won't really see this on the palette, but with contrast medium, if I load up my brush with contrast medium and I zhuzh now next to it, like I said, you shouldn't be able to see anything, but other than maybe whatever's residue from my green paint that was in there, you see a little bit around here. There will be a heavier concentration over here, and there'll be a lighter concentration of it over here, and because I've separated out the 2 pigments, okay, and that's what contrast medium does to contrast paint. So if we combine those 2 things together, and we take a big brush load of Creed Camo and we apply this on the palette like that, wash our brush, and then take a big brush load of contrast medium, what we now have is a 1-to-1 mix of Creed Camo and contrast medium. But if I zhuzh again, as you can see, what we now have lesser concentrate over here, lighter over here. Compare the two. Okay, so this is half strength Creed camo with contrast medium. Alright, but what we've still got there is we've still got, you can see, it's slightly less, but you can still see my brush marks in here. They're much more pronounced there, but you can still see them in here. And that's okay, that's not a problem. But we do still have two very distinct different sets of pigment right there, two different colours. This is just the half strength version of that. Now, if we use Lahmian Medium instead, what you'll see is you'll see a more consistent colour across all of it in general. So we'll take a big brush load of the Creed camo and we'll apply this just here like that, and then we'll wash our brush and take a big old brush load of Lahmian Medium and we apply this. Okay. Now, what you'll see here is a much more defined edge around here, okay? Because we're not kind of thinning down the two pigments at the same time in two different ways with the contrast medium. And what you'll see is that this kind of feels a little bit more kind of like slightly different to this one. It's not a huge difference, but there is a slight difference here in that what we've done here is we've basically mixed the two pigments together using one medium to create a sort of paint that still does the same effect, okay? And you see it's a little bit more cloudy around here as opposed to a little bit more kind of like sort of a little bit more brush strokey over here. And of course this is without any contrast medium in it, any medium in it whatsoever. And the reason being for this is, and this is why I generally use Lahmian Medium, and we'll get to more reasons as to why that is. But what I want you to do now is just have a quick look, right? So if I take a brush load of Creed camo on my brush here, you can see how kind of, and this is a full brush load, you can see how kind of bulbous my brush load is. Now I wouldn't now paint with this because this is way too much paint. We've talked about that before here on the channel. You don't want to have this much paint on your brush, but you can see how bulbous that is. And if I hold my brush like this, you can see a drip sort of start to appear at the tips of the bristles, but it's not really going to drip out onto my finger anytime soon. It's clinging to those bristles in that respect, if that makes any sense whatsoever. Now, if we do the same thing with contrast medium, again, similar size brush load. So you should see that a drip will start to form. You see how bulbous my brush is at the end. A drip will start to form, but it's not going to drip out onto my hand because it's just clinging to the bristles. Just hold it. Again, this would be way too much paint to paint with. But there you go. It has exactly the same properties as before. Whereas, if we do the same thing with Lahmian Medium, if I really load the brush up, what you should see is it will drip on my hand eventually. It's really kind of all collecting towards the end. Again, way too bulbous. I wouldn't recommend painting with that. But see how much space there is between the bristles and the medium. There you go, kind of. Yeah. So basically, it's a lot runnier, Lahmian Medium. And that's why we use it. Or at least that's why I like to use it. Because what it does is it makes the paint feel way more familiar to paint with. And contrast medium makes more contrast paint. So if using contrast paint is the thing you struggle with, Lahmian Medium helps you eliminate more of that contrast aspect. It'd be kind of like if you were to, let's say you were making a tomato sauce and you use some tomato puree, right? Like if you have tomato puree and you add more puree to it, what you get is thinner puree. But if you add water to it instead, what you get is thinner. It would become much more liquidy as opposed to more puree, as it were. So what contrast medium is really good for is creating weaker colour. What Lahmian Medium is good for is creating more flow improvement. And that's basically why I use it. more often these days. Now, that's not to say that Lahmian Medium doesn't have any dilution effect. It does have light dilution effect, but what contrast paint has, and we think we've already talked about it tonight, but as we've kind of mentioned here, and we'll go back to this overhead just here, what contrast paint generally tends to have is two different colors in it, 1 and 2, like that sort of thing. And you can see, like, this is the same order of things. So this was no medium, this was contrast medium, and this was Lahmian medium. I'm not sure how well the camera will represent it, and you can test these things yourselves, but you can see if I do that kind of thing, I don't know how well you can see this, but this is starting to run as opposed to this that isn't. So what we can do is, if we go 1 Blood Angels Red, 2 Blood Angels Red, 3 Blood Angels Red, 1 with Lahmian Medium, 1 with Contrast Medium, and 1 without, and then we kind of drag race them. There's your Lahmian Medium. There's your Contrast Medium. And that's without. So again, you see how we still have the two colours, red here, red there, red here, red there, red. and red. That's your drag raced mediums right there. So that's your Lahmian Medium doing that. That's your Contrast Medium doing that. That's without any contrast paint in it, without any medium in it whatsoever. So as you can see, this has flowed a lot. This has flowed a lot easier than that has. If that might be the best representation of Lahmian Medium versus Contrast Medium. What do you think? So it's better to use Lahmian Medium if someone has problems with patchy contrast on flat panels, for example. Kinda, yeah. That is kind of how I would sum it up. And in order to kind of lessen the effect, okay, in terms of the dilution, or maybe got the slightly different kind of coloration and this kind of thing, what you will generally see me do in some instances, you will see something like I will use 4 parts 1 paint plus 1 part Lahmian Medium, and that is to get this kind of extra runniness. You can see how that Blood Angels Red has distributed itself a little bit more now that it's flat. Again, if I was to do this, it would probably start to run towards the bottom again. There you go, it moved again, and that moved again, but there you go. I mean, it kind of sums it up a little bit, doesn't it? Just tried this with a Keelian green, and I can definitely tell you what you mean about how Lahmian Medium improves the flow. Exactly. So, given that what we've talked about with Contrast Medium, and this is by no means is this an indictment of Contrast Medium at all. Contrast Medium is excellent medium for creating different colours within your contrast paints. When you add Contrast Medium to a contrast paint, you will, by very nature, it will be runnier because there's more of it, okay, and it's half the color, but it doesn't have as strong a flow improver as Lahmian Medium does. But conversely, Lahmian Medium doesn't have as strong a dilution effect as Contrast Medium does. So the question is, what are you after? Are you after an improved flow, or are you after a diluted paint? And in most of the case, for me, I'm after just a little bit of dilution, but much more improved flow. So, in the example of the Emperor's Children, and we did this in the how to come up with the contrast colours thing, we're looking for a nice smooth paint because we're going over smooth armour panels. But the Lupus Pink itself wasn't quite right. It was too strong, so we needed to thin it down just a little bit. So in that instances, I added 2 brush loads of Lahmian Medium, 1 for the flow improvement properties, and 2 just to bump up that dilution a little bit. Now, if I'd gone for a 1-to-1 with Contrast Medium, it might have done the same thing. However, if the struggle out there is the dark patchiness for some of you guys, then creating more contrast paint isn't going to solve that, because that's a flow problem, right? So that's kind of the gist, as it were. Any other families of paints where mediums are useful? Shades. Yeah, no. So shades you can thin them down. With the difference between, and there's a question earlier about what's the difference between shade paints and new shades and old shades. Basically, what I can sort of half show you, because I don't have a decent range of the old shade paints. I have a couple of old gloss shades, but the difference between them is basically the old shades were a flat shade. It's just one color in the pot, and the build-up of said color in recesses is what gave it the impression of having a dark paint. But it's very, very liquidy. It has the same texture or viscosity, I'm not sure if that's the right word, but the same viscosity as Lahmian Medium, which is very, very runny paint. But it is just a single color that's just very runny that you're using as a shade, which is why you'll often see in kind of things like heavy metal recipes, they'll say we make a shade out of Corvus Black, and what they're doing there is they're just thinning Corvus Black down significantly using a medium to make paint. Because water on its own, for whatever reason, and again, I don't know the science behind it, but water can, in some instances with some paints, it just starts to separate things, because it's introducing this kind of just neutral liquid in there that stuff will just float in at different weights, whereas the paint is still the same thing. So whilst it can separate a little bit, it won't separate as much as water will do, which is why I don't recommend using water with contrast paints. Which one makes it taste better? Jelly Tots. Excellent medium. So an old shade paint is basically just a flat color, and again, this isn't going to be a great example, but an old, because I've only got gloss ones which have a sort of glossy element to them, but this is Reichland Flesh Shade gloss, this is Reichland Flesh Shade, and if I just grab some Reichland Flesh Shade gloss and just apply it on the palette like that, you can see it's mostly a flat colour. Whereas if I use Reichland Flesh Shade, the new formulated version, and I do the same thing that we do before, you can see how it loses power over here. So you've got that darker bit here around the outside where there's heavier, and this is just like a flat thing. So shade paints act in the same way as contrast paints do now. They're just much thinner and less saturated than a contrast paint, which arguably makes shade paints better, because you have those two kind of pigments in them basically, but it means that the heavy pigment should run into the recesses when applied, as opposed to kind of all just lying flat across the surface. I mean, this isn't a great advert for it, because again, this is a very old gloss paint, so that's got heaviness in it anyway, but basically that's the difference between the old and the new. They're just much less strong than a contrast paint. And there we have it, a bit of a theory-based one today, and some of you will remember this one from quite a few months ago now, but I hope that answers the question. Why use Lamian versus contrast medium? It's a simple question, really, and this is the answer. If you enjoyed this video, you love the channel, and you'd like to support me further, you absolutely can do so by heading to patreon.com/Warhipster, just like all of these wonderful, amazing people have done. And alternatively, you could become a YouTube channel member by clicking on the join button below, exactly like these fabulous folks have done, scrolling up on the screen before you. There are so many of you out there that it really takes my breath away, and I cannot thank you enough for everything you do, as without you I wouldn't be able to keep making these Contrast Plus videos. And if you really like this video and you want to send me a little thanks, just click on the thanks button just below this video. Don't forget to share it, like it, comment on it, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel, and to make sure you stay up to date, don't forget to click the bell icon. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you all very soon in the next one. Happy wargaming.